Duane Ollinger has gone into the ground before. He has descended into shafts, crawled through excavations, and pushed into spaces that every expert told him were not worth the risk. He has done it with the practical confidence of a man whose relationship to the earth beneath his property is built on years of operational experience. But the descent he made on this specific night, into a shaft whose audio equipment had just captured something that should not exist at that depth, changed what he understood about what is living under Blind Frog Ranch. Subscribe and stay until the very end. It started the way most significant nights at Blind Frog Ranch start, quietly and without any indication that what was about to happen was going to be different from the operational routine that the investigation's years of fieldwork had established as the property's baseline. The evening of the descent began with a standard equipment check along the primary cavern system, the expanding shaft network whose recent instability readings had pushed the investigation team toward a more cautious operational posture in the weeks preceding the session. Duane and Chad had been running through the monitoring sequence that the prior season's underground work had established as the non-negotiable opening procedure for any session involving the active zones of the shaft system: electromagnetic baseline, ground vibration readings, audio environment assessment. Nothing on the monitors suggested the night was going to produce anything beyond the steady accumulation of operational data that the investigation's technical record had been building across multiple field seasons. The air was still. The equipment was functioning within its normal parameters. The underground audio feed was producing the ambient groundwater sounds that had become so familiar across the investigation's field sessions that the crew processed them as background rather than signal. The constant drip and movement of the water system that runs through the cavern network beneath the property's surface. At 9:17 in the evening, that changed. Sound technician Marlin was running the standard audio monitoring protocol when his feed produced something that his years of field audio experience did not have a category for. Not a spike, not an interference event, a dip, an unnatural reduction in the ambient audio environment beneath the shaft, as though the underground space had momentarily drawn itself inward. He adjusted the gain. He checked the equipment for malfunction. He ran the standard interference elimination procedure that the investigation's technical protocols specified for anomalous audio readings. And then, when the waveform resolved through his headset with a clarity that the gain adjustment had sharpened rather than softened, he heard it for the first time, a slow, heavy exhale rising from the darkness beneath the shaft. Deliberate, rhythmic, enormous. Marlin replayed the recording twice before he called Duane over. He needed to be certain he was not imagining. He was not imagining. The moment Duane put on the headset and crouched beside Marlin's equipment, his expression communicated something that the people who have worked alongside him across multiple field seasons recognized as significant. Not alarm, but the specific quality of focused attention that Duane produces when something the property generates does not fit the operational framework he has built across years of engagement with the underground environment of Blind Frog Ranch. He listened. His eyebrows dropped. His posture changed. He lowered the headset after a long moment and asked a single practical question. Was anyone in the lower shaft? Chad confirmed the area was empty. No crew below, no machinery running, no airflow systems active that could account for what the audio feed had captured. That was the moment the second breath arrived. It did not come through the headset this time. It came through the air, rolling up the shaft and into the open space where the crew was working with a volume and a resonance that required no equipment to hear. A deep, heavy exhale that traveled through the metal casing of the audio rig as a physical vibration and settled into the awareness of everyone standing near the shaft opening with the specific weight of a sound that has no conventional explanation. The crew froze. A cameraman whispered a question that nobody answered. Marlin was already pulling the raw recording into his laptop, his hands moving with the speed of a professional whose training was being asked to process something his training had not prepared him for. The waveform analysis he ran on the recording produced findings whose specific character is the most technically significant element of everything the audio equipment captured that night. Human breathing follows a recognizable pattern. A rise, a plateau, and a fall, whose characteristics vary by individual, but whose fundamental structure is consistent across the species. Animal respiratory signatures have their own profiles, varying by lung capacity and body mass, but identifiable through the comparative reference library that forensic audio analysis uses to categorize biological sound sources. What the Blind Frog Ranch audio showed on Marlin's screen did not match either category. The inhale was perfectly uniform, air being drawn through a single massive cavity rather than the bilateral lung structure of any known mammalian species. The exhale carried a resonance spike whose acoustic properties were consistent with a body cavity of a size that the regional biology of northeastern Utah has no candidate for. Marlin ran the spectral analysis. Random environmental sound sources, wind, air movement through tunnel systems, geological vibration, produced scattered data across the frequency spectrum. What the recording showed was a narrow, exact frequency range, controlled, biological. And when he overlaid the waveform against a human respiratory signature scaled 4 to 5 times its normal dimensions, the match was close enough to make him sit back in his chair with an expression that the camera footage from that session captures in a form whose significance the broadcast version of any episode containing it would struggle to manage within its entertainment framework. Whatever was breathing under Blind Frog Ranch had a respiratory system built on the same fundamental architecture as a human being, at a scale that no human being represents. The discussion that followed Marlin's audio analysis was not a long one. The findings were on the screen. The crew had heard the second breath without equipment. The shaft was confirmed empty of any human presence. The options available to the investigation at that point reduced themselves in the practical operational logic that Duane Ollinger applies to the decisions the Blind Frog Ranch investigation requires. To one, someone needed to go down and confirm the source. The alternative was retreating from a shaft whose audio equipment had just produced the most significant biological evidence the investigation had ever captured, without the physical documentation of what the audio was pointing at. For a man whose entire investment in this property has been organized around the pursuit of exactly the kind of confirmation the shaft was now offering, the alternative was not seriously considered. Duane clipped into the harness before the discussion had formally concluded. Chad's objection was immediate and direct. The voice of a man who had watched his father absorb every physical and financial setback the property had produced across years of investigation, and who understood, in terms that Duane's own operational confidence sometimes prevented him from fully weighing, what the audio findings indicated was waiting at the bottom of that shaft. Duane tightened the harness straps and said the thing that his relationship to this property and to this investigation has always produced in response to the reasonable caution of the people around him. That's exactly why I'm going. The descent began at 9:43. The crew controlling the lowering mechanism maintained a slow, controlled rate that Duane had specified. He wanted to hear what the shaft produced as he descended through it, rather than moving through it too quickly to register the audio environment at each depth level. The shaft walls, illuminated by his headlamp as he descended, showed something that his prior descents into the system had not prepared him for: fresh gouges in the clay and rock surface. Long, smooth indentations whose character was not consistent with the mechanical abrasion of excavation equipment or the natural erosion of water movement through the shaft system. They were traces of contact. Something had moved through this shaft recently and had left the physical record of its passage in the material of the walls. The temperature dropped as he descended, not gradually in the way that underground environments cool as depth increases, but noticeably in the way that a change in the thermal environment of an enclosed space communicates a recent disturbance of the conditions that the ambient temperature had established. Something had changed the thermal character of the shaft in the period before Duane entered it. What had changed it was what he was descending toward. Halfway down the shaft, the rope trembled, not from Duane's movement, from below. Chad felt it through his hands on the lowering mechanism before any instrument registered it. A vibration transmitted upward through the rope from a source that was not at the surface and was not mechanical. He called for the lowering to stop. The breathing returned at that moment, not through the audio equipment on the surface, through the shaft itself, a warm, heavy exhale that rose past Duane as a physical event, carrying a temperature and a mass that the confined space of the shaft concentrated into something that registered not just as sound, but as presence. He felt it move past him. The exhale carried the specific quality that Marlin's waveform analysis had documented. The controlled, deliberate respiratory signature of something whose biological scale the surface analysis had established as without precedent in the known fauna of northeastern Utah. At the bottom of the shaft, Duane held his position and directed his headlamp into the darkness below. The beam extended into the void beneath him and found nothing at first. The specific quality of deep underground darkness that absorbs light in a way that surface darkness does not, swallowing the headlamp's output before it reached anything reflective. Then, for a single second, the beam caught movement. Not a defined shape, not a visible organism. A shift, a mass withdrawing from the edge of the headlamp's range into a deeper section of the cavern system, moving with the specific deliberateness of something that had been present at the shaft's base and had chosen to move when the light found it. The withdrawal was not the startled retreat of an animal reacting to sudden illumination. It was controlled, measured, the movement of something that was aware of the light source and was making a decision about its relationship relationship to it. Duane's voice through the radio was tight and controlled when he gave the instruction that the crew on the surface had been waiting for since the descent began. Pull me up. Not frightened, Duane Ollinger's relationship to the underground environment of his property has been built on enough direct experience to produce composure in conditions that would generate panic in most people, but aware in the specific and consequential way that direct proximity to something whose existence the prior seasons of investigation had been approaching without confirming produces in a man whose entire commitment to the Blind Frog Ranch investigation has been organized around exactly this kind of confirmation. When he reached the surface, he sat with the harness still clipped and said nothing for several minutes. Then he looked at the crew and said the thing that the audio analysis, the waveform data, the thermal readings, and the physical evidence in the shaft walls had all been building toward. There's something alive down, and it's watching us. While Duane processed what the descent had produced, Chad directed the crew toward the lower entrance of the cavern system, a narrow channel where groundwater exits the underground network after storm events and whose sediment record preserves the physical evidence of anything that has moved through the tunnel system in the period preceding the investigation session. The decision to examine the lower entrance was the practical field instinct of a man who had spent enough time at Blind Frog Ranch to understand that the property's underground environment always leaves a physical record of what has moved through it, and that the audio evidence and the descent observations needed physical corroboration before the investigation's findings could be characterized as complete. What the crew found at the lower entrance required 30 yards of walking from the main dig site and no significant search time to locate. The sediment that had been undisturbed for years, the stable, compacted mud of a channel that groundwater moves through without significant turbulence, was churned, smeared, split open in deep grooves whose character the investigation's accumulated field experience with the physical evidence of large animal movement could not account for conventionally. The mud had been pushed outward from the tunnel walls as though something of massive cross-section had pressed against them while moving through the passage. Not the impact marks of a creature moving quickly through a tight space, but the sustained lateral pressure marks of a body whose dimensions were near the limits of what the tunnel's internal geometry permitted. Charlie crouched beside the most clearly defined mark, a smooth, curved indentation nearly 3 feet long that tapered at one end with the specific geometry of a limb impression whose originating anatomy had no match in the regional wildlife reference. The direction of the displacement in the mud told the most significant story. The marks showed upward drag, the sediment pattern of something pulling itself out of the tunnel toward the surface rather than moving deeper into the system. Whatever had made those marks had been moving toward the shaft, toward the position directly below where Duane had descended. The timing established by the mud's freshness, assessed by Chad against the investigation's prior baseline documentation of the channel's sediment condition, placed the movement within hours of the investigation session. Something had been moving toward the surface at Blind Frog Ranch in the period before the crew arrived. The water in the pool outside the cavern mouth confirmed it. Still water in a protected channel, undisturbed by wind or surface runoff, was producing gentle ripples at perfectly timed intervals. The rhythm of the ripples matched the breathing interval that Marlin's audio analysis had established for the respiratory signature the equipment had captured. The pool was connected to the tunnel system. What was in the tunnel system was producing those ripples, and the direction of the mud marks established that it had been moving toward the crew's position since before they heard it breathe. Charlie Snyder had worked the technical equipment at Blind Frog Ranch across enough field sessions to develop the specific composure that sustained exposure to the property's anomalous outputs produces in people who engage with them through the mediating framework of instrument readouts rather than direct sensory experience. The thermal camera was his domain. He retrieved the long-range thermal imager and positioned himself above the cavern mouth with the methodical setup procedure that his operational experience had made automatic. Equipment check, sensitivity calibration, exposure adjustment, baseline documentation. The initial scan produced the expected display, blues and purples of cold rock and water, the ambient thermal signature of an underground environment whose temperature the monitoring data had established across prior field sessions. Normal, still, empty. Charlie adjusted the sensitivity upward and increased the exposure duration, the standard procedure for environments whose thermal contrast is low enough to require enhanced detection parameters. And then the shape appeared at the bottom of the display. He leaned closer to the screen, running the instinctive calibration check of a technician whose professional reflex is to eliminate equipment artifact before interpreting anomalous reading. The shape appeared again, clearer, a heat mass, large, elongated, and positioned against the cavern wall at the lower boundary of the thermal camera's detection range. Its thermal profile was not the defined shape of an animal whose body heat concentrates in predictable anatomical zones. It was distributed, multiple warm areas connected along a single elongated form, suggesting internal chambers whose arrangement the thermal imaging was resolving as separate heat sources belonging to a single biological entity. No animal in the region produced a thermal signature with that internal distribution pattern. Charlie said the thing that his display was showing him in the quiet voice of a technician whose professional experience was failing to provide a framework for what he was reading. This thing is alive, and it's huge. The mass moved, not the sudden movement of a startled animal, the slow, deliberate shift of something choosing to change its position. The thermal signature elongated as the mass expanded, contracted as it released, the thermal equivalent of the respiratory cycle that Marlin's audio analysis had documented. The creature was breathing on the thermal display, but the detail that changed the atmosphere among the crew watching Charlie's monitor was what the mass did next. It moved laterally across the cavern wall without leaving the surface, the thermal signature sliding across the rock face as though the organism had the biological capacity to adhere to vertical surfaces and was using that capacity to approach the base of the shaft. Charlie stepped back from the monitor when the mass reached the vertical approach and began moving upward. His voice cracked for the first time across multiple field seasons of Blind Frog Ranch investigation. It's climbing. The thermal display went black, not from equipment failure, from thermal saturation. Something hot, something alive, had moved directly beneath the sensor with enough thermal mass to overwhelm its detection rate. Whatever was in the cavern system at Blind Frog Ranch was no longer at the bottom of it. The thermal display going dark produced a silence among the crew that the property's prior anomalous outputs across multiple field seasons of investigation had not previously generated in quite the same way. The silence of people who have been tracking something through instrument readouts and have just lost the instrument readout while the thing they were tracking was moving toward them. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They stood at the cavern entrance in the specific configuration of people who are collectively processing the same information and arriving at the same conclusion and are not yet ready to say the conclusion out loud. Then the breathing returned. It was louder than the audio equipment had captured it, not amplified by the processing that Marlin's analysis had applied to the raw recording, physically louder in the open air above the cavern, resonating through the ground beneath their feet and vibrating the loose stones at the shaft entrance with a physical force that the earlier breaths had not produced at the surface level. It did not echo. Previous audio events from the underground system had carried the reverberant quality of sounds generated at depth and traveling upward through the acoustic environment of the shaft and tunnel network. This exhale did not have that quality. It resonated, the acoustic signature of a sound source that was no longer at depth. The crew's collective response was the backward movement of a group of experienced investigators whose field history at one of the most anomalous properties in American research had built a baseline of composure that this specific moment exceeded. Chad reached for his father without looking away from the shaft entrance. A fifth breath followed. This one was different in a way that the crew's position above the cavern made immediately perceptible. It came from the mid-level chamber, a section of the underground system that the investigation's structural mapping had established as too narrow for anything of the thermal mass the camera had documented to navigate without compressing its physical dimensions significantly. Whatever was producing the breathing was not constrained by the spatial geometry that its thermal signature had suggested should constrain it. It was compressing, moving through passages that its documented size should have made impassable. Then the breathing shifted direction. Instead of rising vertically through the shaft, the exhale emerged laterally through the fissures and crack systems in the rock adjacent to the crew's position, as though the sound source had moved from inside the shaft to inside the surrounding geological formation. It was not just close, it was moving around them, using the cavern system's three-dimensional architecture to approach from multiple directions simultaneously. Then a second breath appeared in the audio environment, higher pitched, faster, overlapping the first. Chad's question to Duane, "Is that too?" was the question the entire crew was asking without speaking it. Before the answer came, the ground beneath the shaft trembled, not violently, rhythmically, a deep pulsing that corresponded in its timing to the breathing interval Marlin's analysis had established. Something was pressing against the tunnel walls from inside with enough force to register at the surface as ground movement. Duane told the crew to get back to the vehicles, not with panic, with the measured directness of a man making an operational assessment that the available information demanded. Everyone back, now. The retreat was careful, eyes locked on the shaft, nobody running. As they crossed the open ground, the generator lights flickered and died. Total blackout. Then the hum began, deep, resonant, moving through the ground beneath their feet and through the air simultaneously, textured, directional. Charlie stopped walking and said it was responding to them leaving. The final tremor hit as they reached the vehicles, sharp, focused, centered directly beneath the main shaft, Dust displaced upward from the entrance. Rocks clattered down the hillside. And then from somewhere in the open ground between the shaft and the trailers, not from the cavern, not from below, but from the surface, the breathing returned one final time. Whatever was under Blind Frog Ranch had found another way up. Back at base, Duane said what the descent and the audio and the thermal evidence and the mud marks had all been building toward. The breathing was not random, not an echo, not an animal. It was deliberate, mobile, and using the tunnel system as navigation infrastructure, not as a habitat, as a network. That distinction is what changed his understanding. A creature that inhabits a space treats it as environment. A creature that navigates a space treats it as a tool, organized around a purpose. What that purpose is at Blind Frog Ranch is what the investigation must now answer. Duane descended as a man whose understanding was built across years of operational fieldwork. He came back up changed. Whatever is under this property is not simply alive. It is aware, it is mobile, and it is choosing, with a deliberateness the investigation can no longer treat as coincidence, when and how to make itself known.